CHMZ 90.1 FM Tofino, CIMM 99.5 FM Ucluelet, and online at toughcityradio.rocks. Authentically unique West Coast radio.
That's a true story, everybody, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Cameron Dennison, and you are listening to Radio on the West Coast. Today, we're going to be talking about the Wrongful Death Act Reform and Family Compensation Act in British Columbia. And it will not be me doing the talking. It will be Kimberly Johnston, who has a bunch of guests. Good morning, Kim.
Good morning, Cameron.
How are you?
I'm well.
I have to ask the question prior to just turning over the reins. I'll be running the spaceship, but you're running the show. Why did you choose this? How has this come into your heart and your mind to do this as an interview and bring this up?
There were many times I considered just sliding you my clipboard for you to do this interview, but every time I thought of doing that, I had a louder voice say no, because it's a dear issue to me. I'm very passionate about social justice and health justice, and this was a story, Natasha story, Anne's story, who we're going to hear on the line, that got inside my skin, and I couldn't let it go. And so I began talking with Anne Forry, who was gracious enough to take my calls and emails. And then she connected me with Michael James Pennie, who, as you know, is the president of the In Their Name, the Wrongful Death Society, and kind of started a week of conversations with different ministers and different members of government, actually. And by the end of it, I thought, I have to do this interview. It's important for all British Columbians to hear the status quo with respect to the Family Compensation Act in our province.
Well, I've been learning over your shoulder all week, and I'm really grateful, and I'm very excited to meet these guests. So how about, without further ado, we'll introduce people with this.
I'd like to play the clip off the website, the In Their Name website, to just give an overview of the Wrongful Death Act in BC.
All right, I'm going to play this from the website, intheirname.ca.
British Columbians would be outraged if they knew the reality of the province's discriminatory wrongful death laws. Did you know that in BC, when a child, senior, or disabled person is killed by the neglectful or wrongful actions of another, that there is no accountability under BC civil law? Currently, only upon the wrongful death of those with dependents is there financial accountability. Even then, this is largely based on the deceased future lost income. Those who do not have dependents and an income have no worth under the current law in BC. This death without dignity denies the bereaved any opportunity to pursue truth and justice in the name of their deceased loved one. The wrongdoer escapes accountability for their carelessness, recklessness, and disregard for the life taken. The further result is the absence of deterrence. There is no meaningful incentive for institutional policy change to decrease incidents of negligence and wrongful death in our province. It's not like this in other provinces, and this must change. The BC Wrongful Death Law Reform Society has drafted legislation that can fix this problem now. The only thing missing is public pressure on our members of the Legislative Assembly to table and pass this legislation. Contact your MLA now.
So the voice of that video is Michael James Pennie. He'll be on next. We're going to start with Anne Forry. She is the mother of Natasha Forry, who died at Lionsgate Hospital this past October. Good morning, Anne. Are you there?
Yes, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining. We're kind of 3 months into your journey with this. So first off, kudos to you for even being able to stand on your two legs and be here and do these radio interviews. So I'm extremely impressed by that, of your own strength and will. I'm extremely haunted, as I mentioned, by the story of your daughter. And I'm lucky that I'm connected via social media through people who are intimately working and fighting for social and medical justice. So that is how I heard your story. And it gnawed at me and I couldn't let it go. And I would like, if you're willing, to share with our listeners what happened to your family in October 2020.
Right. Yeah. Obviously this is brutal, for lack of better words. I mean, it's just, I'm still in shock. Natasha died on Thanksgiving morning. It's really hard, obviously, to talk about. And, many people say that they can't imagine this loss. And I tell people, well, they need to imagine this loss because this is happening in BC to families. And not only are we enduring the pain of wrongful death, but there's no accountability. And it just makes it so much worse for me. And I have to do this for her. Like, I try not to cry, but I don't have a choice. Natasha was such a great girl, and she was loved by so many people. She was my only child. And so this is a huge loss for me. My life is forever changed, and I'm completely devastated. I don't know how my future looks now without her. We were like sisters. I had her young. I was an only parent the majority of her life. And, she was just such a great girl. She was so fun and gorgeous, and she loved, dance and ballet and everything when she was a kid. And she graduated from Vancouver Secondary School. She had really great friends and just loved by so many people.
I have been looking at these photos, and I had to do a double take when I first read the story of, I couldn't tell at first because there were no labels on some of the pictures of like who was Anne and who was Natasha. I mean, you really looked like you could have been sisters, and then these pictures that I've seen are just so beautiful, and your friendship. And there's one of you in the kitchen that had me up all night last night, just in tears. It's so beautiful. And so
Which picture is that?
She's leaning over you, and you're in the kitchen making cookies. It's just a stunning photograph, and it just like encapsulates completely your closeness. So the emotion of that is heartbreaking, and I just want our listeners to know exactly how did this beautiful relationship halt? Like, how did this tragically come to an end in October?
Yeah, she on October 2nd, she had called me and said that she had a cyst in the inner thigh area that had gotten really large, and she was concerned about it. She was crying. She was in a lot of pain. And I said, well, I think you should go to Lionsgate, because I know that they have, like, there's emergency, and then there's like a secondary emergency where, broken arms and kind of stuff. I don't really know what it's called, but I said, you should go there and get treated. So she did, and she felt better. And I know they just gave her Tylenol that day and sent her home. So we thought that was kind of the end of it. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, looking back, I think they should have definitely given her antibiotics. But as the story unfolds, you'll see that they didn't give her antibiotics until the day before she died. So that was October 2nd when she first went to Lionsgate, and it was my birthday on October 6th. We had a great time. She was her lively self. No issues that I could see with her at all. She was very healthy and just a vivacious girl, and so like full of life and fun. And then everything started to change on October 9th. When she called me in so much pain, and she'd gone to the walk-in clinic, a walk-in clinic in North Vancouver, and they said that they thought it was appendicitis, so to go to Lionsgate. So she went up there, and they, had her there all day, and they did a bunch of tests, and they did a CT scan and all that stuff, and they said that she had swollen lymph nodes, that whatever it was going to go take care of itself in a couple of days. And sorry, I'm getting distracted by the noise outside.
Well, we can't hear it, don't worry.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. So on the 2nd, she she was there for like till 1 a.m. and I called, and they wouldn't. The thing is, when I went to the hospital to go see her on the 2nd, the Friday, they wouldn't let me in because, of COVID. And one of the nurses said, well, she's a grown up, like she can take care of herself. And of course, it's like, well, plenty of grown ups need help in the hospital, but I kind of let it go. And then she called me late at night, and we went and got her, and she was drugged up on pain meds. So I thought, okay, the thing is, I had full confidence in the hospital, so I wasn't questioning anything. I felt like, she was, they'd done all these tests, and so that's what was wrong with her: swollen lymph nodes in the stomach, whatever that means. I don't know, but it'll be better in a couple of days. So that was the end of that, I thought. And then on the Saturday morning, that would be like the 10th, I was out shopping, and she crying. She was crying. She was in so much pain. And this is the hard part for me to talk about, because this is where I question if I failed her, but I did everything I could. And she's like, I'm in worse pain. I said, well, you have to go back to the hospital. Like, that's the logical place for her to go, would be back to the hospital, because again, they're supposed to take care of her, especially at the ER. That's like the last place for help. And so I said, you have to go back. And she spent the day in pain, and her friend came and helped her. And I thought about, because I'm in Vancouver, I thought, well, I'll go and take her. But again, it's like I knew I couldn't get in because they wouldn't let me in before. And so her friend took her, and her friend said that she could barely walk. Her stomach was all swollen. Her leg was all swollen. No doctors called me. But I didn't take it seriously because the hospital wasn't taking it seriously. So they did a bunch of blood tests apparently, and they had done an x-ray on the Friday, the day before, and it was clear. Her lungs were clear. But on the Saturday, they just did blood tests, and they just doubled her pain meds, sent her home in a cab at 1 a.m. She texted me, and I said, okay. I thought, okay, good, you're home, you're safe. It's whatever it is, they got to know what they're doing, because it's the hospital. Everybody says, she's in the best place possible. And so that was fine. And I just thought, well, she's going to be okay. And then on Sunday the 11th, she called me, and it was the worst day of my life, because she couldn't breathe. And she was she's like, Mom, it's hard. I can't even breathe. And I said, well, you got to call an ambulance. And she didn't want to call an ambulance. She said she was going to go lie down. I said, no, Natasha, you have to call an ambulance. So she called an ambulance. I think it was like 10 or 11 in the morning. Seemingly took forever, even though she's like in North Vancouver, about 12, 15 blocks from the hospital. It took for like 12 minutes, I think, to get there. And of course I was stressed out, but I started to really become in shock, because it was like, this went from like a little stomach thing, that swollen lymph nodes. And I thought, well, how did it go from that to such an extreme situation? So she went with the ambulance, and I thought, and that later in the review, I found that she was waiting outside for the ambulance. Like, Natasha did everything she could to help herself, and so did I. And the hospital failed her, like epic failure, catastrophic.
I want to just interrupt a minute about that failure and something that you did to advocate for her, which was very impressive. It's a little bit of a jump forward, but her chart, you asked the ER doctors if her chart was checked for post-op infection from the cyst. Can you tell us about that experience of finding out that the doctors weren't looking at the prior surgery?
Yeah, well, that happened on the Sunday. So if I just go back to so I go to Lionsgate after she's arrived in the ambulance, and then they let me in, right?
Okay.
So all of a sudden I'm allowed in.
Oh, strange.
And so I was like, okay. And she was in one of those glass rooms, and I couldn't go in there. So I did the I love you thing through the glass. And then they did let me go in. I put all the protective gear on, and I went in there, and she was really struggling to breathe. But honestly, I mean, in a way, I'm glad I didn't know that she was going to die, because I would have lost my mind. Mm-hmm. I just told her to try to relax, just try to just focus on your breathing, because I didn't know what else to say. And then they were busy doing stuff. So I thought, okay, I'm in the way. So I got out of the way, and I didn't know that was the last time I'd see my daughter alive. And then she went up to ICU, and they told us, to just, come back in a few hours. So that's where it was interesting, because an ICU doctor called, there was grumblings of her going up to ICU, and that's when everything changed for me, because I know what ICU means. Okay, ICU is between life and death, and it's one way or the other. You know what I mean? It's the most extreme. And so the ICU doctor called, and he had said that they were treating her for COVID. They thought it was COVID. And then I said, could this have anything to do with the cyst on October 2nd? And he said, oh, she didn't mention it to me. Okay, well, it's in her chart. And he was very nice, though, but he said that changed everything. And then they started giving her antibiotics. And so then they were treating her for COVID and an infection, because I had thought, well, this could be a staph infection that's gone internally, except, and not showing externally. And he said, yeah, that makes sense. And I am by no means a doctor. And so they started treating her differently. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because that was the way in which you advocated for her. That was a turning point in her care, and it was missed, as far as I understand.
Had I been able to get in there on the Friday, I would have asked. Certainly the Saturday, when her leg is swollen, she thought it was had water fluid, retaining water or whatever. But she had a fever. She had all these things going because her body was trying to help her, fight. And anyway, yeah. So that's what happened on the Sunday. Is the the ICU doctor, and then everything just went crazy from there. And he said he's putting on her a ventilator to help her breathing.
Did she get put on a ventilator?
Yeah, shortly after that. And he told her that, he's going to put her on a ventilator. And she said, go for it. Those are her last words. So, and then, when we were up in the ICU, we got to see her, and they put her on her stomach like they do for COVID patients. Like, this was just such a huge current of like quick events, like just so fast, right? Like, it was so changing so much. And then the nurses would come in, and a couple of them were like, oh, we've got the best doctors here, miracles happen here, she can make it, no problem, we've seen great things happen. And then we get the ICU doctor come in, and he's like, all, your daughter's very sick. And I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean? She's very sick. Yeah, okay, well, what's wrong with her? We're not sure. And so it was just like that the whole day on Sunday. And then they're talking about, they put her on a kidney dialysis machine. And so it just went downhill real fast. And then I was like, well, they said that there's really nothing we could do, just try to see how she responds to the kidney dialysis. And so I was hopeful about that. And then they said, it's best that you just go home. So we went to like a friend's place and stayed there. And then at 4 a.m, the Lionsgate called, obviously that dreaded call when you see Lionsgate Hospital on your phone. And they said that they were going to do surgery on her if it was okay, if I gave permission. I'm like, of course, I'm going to. And they thought it might be flesh-eating disease. And so I said, okay, because her thigh area and her legs were purple. And so they wanted to do exploratory. And then during surgery, she had a cardiac arrest. I've heard conflicting things about what happened during surgery that I don't have answers to. That the anesthesiologist didn't call a code when the nurses wanted to. Like, this is inside information I've heard as her mother. I don't know what the truth is because I can't get access to the truth.
Why can't you get access to the medical information?
The Vancouver Coastal won't give it to me. So we'll get to that part in the review. So she had cardiac arrest. We got a call at around 6 a.m. Please come to the hospital right away. So I thought, okay, it's either she's brain dead, they got to amputate something, or she's dead. She's dying, or she's dead, right? Because they don't want you to come to the hospital otherwise in these situations. So it was so traumatic and so surreal. And so we went there, and the doctor, was crying basically and said that, we lost her Thanksgiving morning. And, he wanted answers because he said that he got her too late. Mm-hmm. And my question is, how did he get her too late when she was there on the Saturday, the day before, the Friday, the day before, and the 2nd? This isn't like she came on the 2nd and didn't come back till the 11th. she was there 2 days before that. So for Lionsgate to say they got her too late, or, that something they couldn't control, is ridiculous. So then it was like something just completely surreal where, you have to put on all the protective gear. And my boyfriend Daryl and I, we went, turned the corner, and all these nurses were just standing there staring at us. Like just staring blankly at us.
What?
And then we went into, like, I don't know why. It was like so horrible.
Yeah,
I told Vancouver Coastal, you guys can't do that to people again. Like, if you lose a patient tragically, get the nurses out of the way, okay? Yeah, they're in shock, but it's actually worse for the family.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went into the room and said goodbye to Tash, 29 years old, healthy, wasn't given one antibiotic until she was in ICU. And it was just the worst day of my life, and I haven't been able to recover from that, obviously.
And I'm so sorry. I know you hear it all the time, but I actually do imagine it. I don't want to say I can't imagine it. I do. And I think anyone that thinks that we have access to first-class medicine in this province should also endeavor to imagine it. I want to back up and ask you about the COVID-19 diagnosis. Obviously, you're not a medical professional. You are a mom, but you lived through that experience. Do you think that by focusing on the COVID-19 diagnosis in the ER, doctors may have missed crucial signs of the staph infection?
Well, I don't think they were treating her for COVID, but the whole COVID thing prevented me from getting in to see her. But the ironic thing is, when she died, I was allowed to bring anybody I wanted in for compassionate reasons. So it's like, oh, okay, so I'm not allowed to see her peer advocate during her, fighting to save her life. But when she's dead, we can bring anybody in. That was part of the problem. And so, they did test her for COVID. She did not have it. They did nasal, they did the lungs. So that ruled out. But I don't know. We have questioned that, and they said no. I just honestly think they didn't take her seriously. I think they thought that she was young. Maybe they said something about her pain tolerance. That's why they dumped her pain meds. Like, honestly, she was so beautiful. And when I saw her in the ER, she looked really good. Like, I'm not kidding. She looked beautiful. So she didn't look like she was gray or pasty or sweating. Right. I mean, obviously she was struggling to breathe, but I think that they just did not take her seriously.
So they didn't take the swollen lymph nodes as a sign of infection.
Well, that's what my question is. Isn't that mean if something's happening? But what I've heard in the review is that swollen lymph nodes can happen if you have a cold or something, and it heals itself. But again, I'm not a doctor.
Right. So
I seem to have asked more questions than many of them have.
Yeah, because she didn't have a cold, but she had swollen lymph nodes and pain after surgery
from a staph infection. So yeah, and it's like, I don't understand how they said that they did look at the area, on the Friday or the Saturday. But again, it's like, why didn't they say, let's just give her antibiotics out of precaution? What if this is an internal infection, which it turned out to be? And it basically traveled up her body into her lungs, causing pneumonia and sepsis, or and that was, her autopsy is a staph infection due to that went septic and pneumonia. I mean, honestly, I don't know the wording, but that's basically what happened.
In your opinion, was this medical negligence?
Absolutely, 100%. So, I think that the good thing is the ICU doctor wanted answers, so immediately Lionsgate had to do a review, or they wanted to do a review. So they did a review with the hospital, similar staff from Richmond, did a panel to interview Lionsgate Hospital. Some of the nurses took stress leave because they're so stressed out by what happened to Natasha. I mean, this really impacted North Vancouver, West Vancouver, where Natasha lived. And so the Vancouver Coastal did a panel. They did a quick review, thorough review, interviewed all the doctors, all the nurses, brought us in to tell us that their findings were that they were going to make some changes. One being like the triage, the internal thing with the hospital. The two things that I think could have saved Natasha's life was, one, that they're going to change it so that if a patient, gets pain medication, like heavy medication, that they don't just let them go home right away. But then I think the one that could have saved Natasha's life is now that they said they're going to implement where, a loved one gets a FaceTime call with the doctor, to discuss what's going on with the patient. And it's like, oh, okay, so 10 months or 8 months into a pandemic, you guys are figuring that is actually probably a good idea. Had I had a call with the doctor and not given 100% confidence into Lionsgate being able to take care of her over some numerous visits, had I had that call with the doctor, then I would have been able to ask questions and say, what about her leg? Why is her leg swollen? Like, that is a sign of something going on. This is not swollen lymph nodes. And when we did the review, I asked the doctor there, like, is the swelling a sign of swollen lymph nodes? And he said, no. They admitted that there was epic failures, Lionsgate and Vancouver Coastal.
And so they admitted it. And now what is your recourse as her mom, having gone through this? When all of this happened and you started to advocate for her in a litigious way, what were you told?
Well, the recourse that I got, and this is what you get in wrongful death, a review, which a lot of people don't even get or do many months later. I got a review, which I don't get access to. They won't give it to us under Section 51, which is basically that if doctors say something about other doctors, they don't want that getting out. So I only get what their changes are. So that is unacceptable. And the only other recourse I have is a complaint with the College of Physicians. Now, anybody who looks up the College of Physicians, whether it's Google reviews or through loved ones, will see that it's lame at best. Mm-hmm. It's very, I haven't heard anything positive. There's no repercussions. And the thing that I have is not only has my daughter been, there's blatant negligence, but these doctors with their great thinking on how to treat Natasha are still treating other patients. So nobody knows who these doctors are. I mean, I know because of the college. I know the names of the doctors. I know the names of the doctors because of the pain meds from the Friday night to the Saturday night, the double. I know those doctors' names, okay? But they are still practicing. There's nothing happening to them.
So there's no accountability. There's no trial. There's no lawsuit. There's nothing currently you can do.
Nothing. And you know what's weird? Some of the, because I know sort of nurses through people that people are like, oh, there's going to be lawsuits. Oh, heads are going to roll. Oh, this is going to be really, crazy. This is a major issue. We called lawyers because people told us to. Mm-hmm. They all said the same thing. You know what? We really sympathize. We wish you could help you. This is terrible what happened, but our hands are tied. There's nothing we can do. And even when we went to the review with Vancouver Coastal, we should have had a lawyer there, okay? But lawyers can't help us. So there's nothing for us. So to say that they can, I can't say kill my daughter because they didn't kill her, but to not give her proper care and negligence, clear negligence, not give her a fighting chance is a disgrace. And to know as her mother that this whole other world that I didn't know about, and I would think the majority of BC people, residents don't know, and it seems to be only the lawyers and the government, that this is the way it's set up. Like, I just thought you could get answers. I thought you could sue hospitals. I thought you could take, have a court date. Why the hell can't I? And it's because of this law. It's set up to protect the corporations, the hospitals, and certainly not the victims and the families. So the loss of, being a single mom to Natasha, who I presumed was going to take care of me when I got old, is gone. Not only am I grieving the loss of my daughter, which is still very new, and every day I wake up to this and every night I go to sleep with this grief, but to know that my government doesn't support me, that basically they just turn their eyes, and then, to know that, like, this has been all political parties have had this on their desk and have done nothing, is an absolute disgrace.
Well,
I just can't believe it.
We are going to talk about that with Michael, who's on the line next after we finish our conversation. We're also going to talk about that politically with Mike DeJong, who's on the call at 10. You mentioned something that you didn't know that you would be part of this group or part of this reality. It's like a club. They say, when you lose a child, it's a club that you never want to belong to. But here you are. And here you are advocating for your precious and beautiful daughter. And unfortunately, you're in good company with some incredibly strong advocates. So I am going to close our story knowing that there will be advocacy because of the incredible people like yourselves and Michael and all the people in your organization, all the lawyers. I have great confidence that things are going to change. Too little, too late for you, though. And I'm so sorry that you don't have justice for your daughter.
Okay.
I'm going to play your song request, though, before we talk to Michael. And tell us why you chose Sam Smith.
Oh, it was just, I didn't really have any song in mind, but I just thought it sounded really sadly beautiful, and Tasha liked Sam Smith, and I can't listen to a lot of music, and I can't look a lot of photos of her, but I think that she likes Sam Smith, so I think it would be appropriate. And it's a beautiful song.
We're going to play him. And I will say, I learned from an Indigenous group of people that were living in BC that for the first year that they don't look at pictures of their loved ones who've died because there's this fear that you'll go with them, if you know what I mean. And
sorry, I can't hear you for the phone.
Oh,
sorry,
just that it's just very normal to not look at pictures. And in a lot of First Nations societies, they don't, or they put the pictures away because there's this acknowledgement that you, the living person, will go with them, the person that is photographed. And that if you need to be here on this earth fighting and advocating, we need you here. So
right.
I took heart with that advice, and I was like, it's okay if we can't look at photos right away. And we're back on air with Michael James Pennie. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Kimberly. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I'm going to just get right into some questions for you. Who are you? Tell us a little bit about the society, and then if you don't mind, just summarizing the current Family Compensation Act. And then we'll mute you, Anne, just because, so we can have Mike on the floor.
Yeah, so basically, I'm just your average British Columbian. So much like Anne, she worked in the film industry, and so she's been able to apply her unique talents for advocacy. I was a business owner. I worked in business development and marketing and a bit of the legal field. And so it touched, a wrongful death touched my family about a decade ago. And so the BC Wrongful Death Law Reform Society was incorporated in 2015, but it actually goes back much further in time. We were known as the Wrongful Death Law Reform Working Group. And the earliest families involved kind of date back to about the 90s. And it's a club, like you said earlier with the interview with Anne, is that it happens and then you meet others that have experienced the same and who've been left with this burning sense of injustice when they weren't able to hold wrongdoers accountable. And then they've continued to pass the baton forward as more families have gotten involved. And then I ended up stepping in as the president in just at the end of 2018. And then I was able to kind of apply some of my unique skills to be able to kind of create awareness and step our online presence up a lot and start educating the public on this issue. So what the Family Compensation Act is it's the legislation in British Columbia that deals with when someone is wrongfully killed, and it kind of directs or guides judges and lawyers on what sort of compensation or recourse may be available under the law. So presently, our legislation only values people who meet the discriminatory criteria of having both an income and dependence. So essentially, if you're a breadwinner and you have young children who depend on you and you're wrongfully killed, basically you have a claim for damages at that point because those people they've lost that future lost income that they would have relied upon to grow up and become adults. So this legislation actually goes back to the United Kingdom. In 1846, there was Lord Campbell who passed this new act at the time to protect families from being destitute when the breadwinner was killed on the railroads. And so they said, okay, well, in these cases of wrongful death, we don't want to leave these families orphaned, so we'll allow for wrongful death claims to come about to sue for these economic damages, this future lost income. However, 175 years later, we have perhaps much more modern standards for how we dignify and value human life. And pretty much all the other provinces, as well as the Yukon, have modernized their legislation to put another class of what are called non-pecuniary or non-economic damages, called loss of companionship, loss of care, guidance, affection, and love. And that's like the basic foundation of how we would value human life, so that people, if they're wrongfully killed, we can actually quantify under the law what that loss would have been, which would allow for recourse in every other province as well as the Yukon. But BC has just simply not made this modernization, and we're just so far behind in Canada as well as the rest of the developed world.
So Natasha doesn't qualify.
So under the law, because Natasha didn't have any dependents, her life is worthless.
That is a big statement. Do you think that lawmakers, that the Attorney General in British Columbia would agree with that statement? It seems stark.
Yeah, it certainly does. And it's interesting because every time a political party is campaigning and they want to, hold office or take government, they say, yes, this Family Compensation Act needs to be reformed, and we're going to do it. We're going to look at it right away. So this goes back to the NDP government back in the 90s. They were aware of it at that time. The incumbent Liberal government was like, yeah, we're going to take a look at this wrongful death thing. Something needs to be done in that area. And that was in 2001. And then about a decade later, finally, MLA Ralph Sultan, Liberal MLA out of West Vancouver, says, this is ridiculous. This has gone on too long. I'm putting forth a private member's bill.
What's a private member's bill? Could you just explain that for people that might not know how the government works?
Yeah, certainly. So in government, any member of the Legislative Assembly can put forth their own or table their own legislation. And they would table it at the legislature and say, this is a legislation I think we should have passed. They'd provide arguments accordingly, and then everyone would vote on it.
So it could be personally relevant to them, not even their constituency. So our local MLA, just for example, could do this even if it wasn't an issue in the constituency, if it was important to her or him.
That's correct. Yeah,
okay.
Any MLA could technically do that.
Okay.
Although what I think we're seeing is that, especially in the current NDP government, is that no one wants to step out of line. They're all wanting to be in the good graces of their fellow party members. If they don't vote along party lines, they get whipped. They can be punished by being backbenched. So no one wants to step out of line. So everyone kind of just defers to the Attorney General to kind of look at this issue. But Ralph Sultan, the difference with him is that he was kind of like this institution. He was highly respected, and he'd been in government for a long time. He had an incredible education and career history. And so people, I think, really looked up to him. So he kind of was able to get away with putting forth this private member's bill. But ultimately at the time, ICBC had closed door discussions with the Liberal cabinet. They provided these reports and just somehow said stuff to the Liberals that talked them out of it. We were never told of what was said. We were told that this is an in-camera private item. The reports were never made available to us or to the public to scrutinize. And then suddenly after that, the Liberals just went cold turkey on us or our group, and we're not interested in doing any sort of review or modernization.
So you had communication prior to the meeting with Ralph Sultan that they were on board for reform. The meeting happens, he brings forth the private members bill, and then stonewalled?
Yeah, essentially, our group back then, we kind of had a media storm like we're having now, where we had a big rally at the art gallery. We're on the cover of the Province, the Sun, we're on the mainstream media news. And then it all culminated in Ralph Sultan bringing forth this private members bill. And then the Liberal cabinet decided just not to proceed with it, and it was just voted down.
Now, this is a question because I'm not as savvy as you are with the law. How is that constitutional or even legal?
Well, it's really bizarre that when the public demands wrongful death modernization so that their loved ones have value under the law and legal recourse, it's interesting how ICBC is considered such a higher level stakeholder than the public, who the legislators are actually supposed to be serving.
Yeah, like how many signatures do you have to petition the reform?
Well, the way it's another kind of funny sideshow here is that the way the Election Act works in BC is that you actually need in-person, door-to-door sort of signatures, and you need like in the hundreds of thousands to be able to bring forth something to be able to make it go to like a referendum. And so the only thing I see on the history of that being successful was repealing the HST back in I think it was like 2010. But aside from what we're doing, we're basically saying we set up the petition system on our website so that people can kind of put their name in the hat and let their local MLA know that this issue concerns them. And it allows us to be able to kind of engage with the public and kind of keep this momentum building and snowballing.
And what has your society done specifically to just help lawmakers so that it's easy to modernize the act? Like, do you actually have a working document of a new law?
Yeah, so we've drafted a new piece of legislation called the Wrongful Death Accountability Act. And we've done all the legislative research from all the provinces across Canada, a few of the US states, the Yukon, which recently modernized in 2014. We cherry-picked the best aspects. We put it into one drafted piece of legislation. We provided that to the NDP as soon as they came and took government in 2017. We provided a revised version early last year, and I just last week sent Attorney General Minister Eby another revised version. So the legislation, it's all researched, it's drafted, it's ready to go. We've been consulting with the public for the last 20 plus years on this. Like, we are the stakeholder. We've done all the work for them. It's ready to be tabled. It's ready to be passed. So there's really no excuse not to move on this.
Do you hear back from Attorney General?
So it's really bizarre because the NDP prior to the 2017 election, they said 100% this Family Compensation Act needs to be modernized. It's inhumane, it's archaic, it's an injustice. And then they came into office and then they simply say, oh, we're not reviewing it at this time. And they kind of just sloughed us off for a few years. Finally, after I met with about 20 MLAs in 2019, I finally got a meeting with David Eby. He seemed really open and receptive. It was a really positive meeting. A couple of weeks later, he actually introduced our society at the legislature during question period. He'd asked for the most revised legislative recommendations. We provided those to him on March 9th, 2020. And then after that, we didn't hear anything. And I followed up multiple times. I requested meetings like, let's go over this drafted legislation, and just nothing. And then the NDP released a statement that there are diverging views in government essentially to the value of human life and to whether we're going to allow for accountability to wrongdoers in legal recourse and access to justice in this province.
Yeah, that was my next question. So there are diverging views with respect to the value of human life in this province. What does this mean? And do you think most British Columbians know of this sentiment by the NDP?
Yeah, so, they're sending this as kind of a copy and paste response to, the over 9,500 people who've petitioned their MLAs so far, and they're getting this cut and paste response. And I see these email replies, people are being like, diverging views. What does that even mean? Like, are you one of these people who holds these diverging views that human life should remain worthless only in the province of BC? So people are very confused by that. And so we've pressed these politicians to say, what does this even mean? And we get little hints that like, oh, well, ICBC, or they'll say stuff like, oh, the insurers, like they'll say stuff like that as if there's some major stakeholder, and that's just completely stalled the legislative modernization process.
Well, I have a statement from David Eby's office. As you may or may not know, I reached out last week. I wanted to get him on the line. It was wishful thinking. So I have a statement from his office. We believe in a need for reform in this area, and it is a priority for the ministry to address it in this mandate of government. And then I also reached out to MLA Osborne, our local MLA, and the statement from her office is MLA Osborne is glad that it is going to be a priority for the Ministry of Attorney General to act on within the next 4 years. So I have these two statements side by side. I want to ask you, is there any reason we should doubt these statements when they seem genuine, authentic?
I'm sorry, I disagree with you that they seem genuine and authentic. I think that David, in our meeting on October 9th, 2019, he said we'd get to reviewing this in the spring 2020 legislative session. They like to use COVID as an excuse, but I mean, that actually made their job way easier because they're able to pass all their legislation without any real public oversight or scrutiny. So it made their job a lot easier. So we've drafted the legislation. It can get done now. It can get done this year. So the next Natasha Forry family is not hung out to dry when they're wrongfully killed. So how many more wrongful deaths are we going to have happen in the next 4 years while they pretend to address this issue?
How do we know if they're addressing it? Is that public? How can we actually know for sure that the Office of the Attorney General is currently addressing this issue?
Well, we have no way to know for sure whether they're addressing it at all, because every time there's another media firestorm around a wrongful death, they pay lip service and say, oh yeah, we're going to look at this. And then we get a letter 6 months later saying, oh, sorry, Family Compensation Act is not up for review after the media circus blows over.
How many wrongful deaths have there been in BC on the roads or in the hospitals? How many wrongful deaths?
So that's difficult to determine overall, because it really relies upon the government actually providing us with those figures. I think just, again, real shooting from the hip off the top of my head, I think it's maybe 200 to 300 a year motor vehicle accidents. That considers all that would be not at fault or at fault. And then if we look at the CMPA data, the Canadian Medical Protective Association, there's about 900 lawsuits brought against doctors. And that includes, not just wrongful death, but injury in Canada per year. So we're not necessarily dealing with a lot of wrongful deaths here. So that's one of the challenges we've kind of experienced in our advocacy, is that it touches very few people, but those people are often siloed, and it's very difficult for them to articulate the issue that, hey, there's no accountability when you wrongfully kill someone in this province.
Well, speaking of motor vehicle accidents in ICBC, they're changing to a new model. They're calling it enhanced care. Many British Columbians are calling it no fault. Is it going to help families who've lost loved ones to accidents on the road? Because don't the damages or the benefits go up with enhanced care as opposed to the system that we have now, where the benefits are almost nothing, especially when we have this Family Compensation Act?
Yeah, so enhanced care coverage is basically just an Orwellian doublespeak name for no fault. It's a pure no fault system where nobody's at fault. Accidents are simply an act of God now. And it will help people who actually are at fault. Like, there's a little bit more benefits available to them under the law, but people who were not at fault in accidents have their benefits, I'm using their language, benefits. I'm talking, the actual word should be damages. Their damages are essentially non-existent. So since the accident's no one's fault, they can't sue for pain and suffering damages anymore, or diminished quality of life. So that kind of whole class of damages has just completely been wiped out. And then it's given ICBC complete legal immunity, because people aren't able to retain a lawyer to advocate for their care and recovery on a contingency basis. So people are really hung out to dry and left on their own. A lot of people don't know what their rights are. And if someone's had a brain injury, if they've been injured in a motor vehicle accident, that's even further detriment to advocating for their care and recovery. So it's just given ICBC just complete power over our lives, and we have way less recourse now. And then they could have modernized the Family Compensation Act at the same time, but they chose not to. They just left the Family Compensation Act as is, which would have been an opportune time while ICBC was changing over to this no-fault model.
So it seems like there are two ways, or probably many ways, that a wrongful death can happen. But I'm thinking of Natasha's story in the hospital, and I'm thinking of being in a car accident. So are you seeing more wrongful deaths on the roads, or are you seeing the same amount in hospitals? Like, what are you seeing in your experience? Where are these fatal accidents happening?
So the majority of wrongful deaths are going to be coming from the roads. There's going to be some medical negligence wrongful deaths, and then there's going to be property owners who and business owners who don't take the proper care and precautions to prevent it. So it could be a little old lady could slip and fall at a parking lot or at a grocery store, and she could break her hip and die a week later. Stuff like that. So it spans basically both the public and private sectors, and there's different insurers that span those sectors as well.
And so when you're petitioning and lobbying for the reform, what are the arguments against reform? Like, who are the main players presenting these arguments in meetings when you're seeing it being lobbied in the other way? Like, what about the medical insurance group? Are they pro-modernization of the act?
So basically, an insurance company has two duties. This is the reason we brought in insurance. The first duty is to take care of people when something really bad happens as a safety net. The second, and arguably the more important function, is that they're actually supposed to deter injury and wrongful death in the first place by incentivizing their insured to have safer standards and protocols, which would allow them to have lower rates. That's how it's supposed to work. In British Columbia, when we're in the insurance game, as ICBC is, as the healthcare protection program is, and it's free to kill, and they both have monopolies, there's not a lot of incentive, or arguably not as much incentive as they have in other jurisdictions, to prevent injury and wrongful death in the first place by focusing on root cause prevention. So it allows an organization like ICBC to end up getting really bloated in their bureaucracy, and they now have close to double the workforce as any private insurer of the same customer base size. So they're just not held to account by any market forces. They're not held to account by actually the public having rights and recourse when people are wrongfully killed. So they just do whatever they want. And they don't want to be held accountable. They want to keep this bloated bureaucracy where they don't have to be accountable for their poor decisions and poor management. And so they have fought against this modernization that we've seen in other jurisdictions. With respect, however, to the Canadian Medical Protective Association, which insures physicians and surgeons, by the way, the BC taxpayer subsidizes those fees to the tune of at least 50% annually. The CMPA hasn't actually put up much resistance to this modernization. They said, well, we insure physicians and surgeons across Canada, and these other provinces have had this modernization. So it's kind of a natural course of events that BC will have this modernization, and we don't really oppose that because they have a $6 billion fund and the taxpayers pay $500 million annually into it. So they're good. So that's kind of what we're seeing, kind of the landscape of insurance.
Well, that is positive. So there seems like one strong lobby group against this. When you have the medical insurance for the hospitals and the doctors not blocking it, it points to one lobby group blocking it.
Yeah, just to clarify, it is ICBC, and then it is, my understanding is it is the Healthcare Protection Program, which is an adjunct to the Risk Management branch of the Ministry of Finance. So the Ministry of Finance has some responsibility there. With kind of their culture of cover-up for opposing and blocking this modernization, as does ICBC, the Crown Corporation.
I have so many questions for you. As I could talk to you for an hour, but I'll get in trouble for not playing any music. I want to ask you one question. So with criminal law, the psychology around it is that the punishment very seldom deters the crime in the first place. So I want to put that out to you. If the law were modernized and were reformed, do you think it would actually deter medical negligence? Do you think it would change the way people drive? How does reforming the law actually prevent the behavior that are causing the fatal accidents?
I'll give you the perfect illustrative example. So in 1997, one of our society's founders, Catherine Adamson, her daughter, Heidi Klumpus, was hit by a drunk driver. Both her shin bones were broken. She survived the accident, although died a matter of weeks later due to a series of preventable medical errors, namely fat embolism syndrome. That's when you don't reset long bone fractures in a timely enough manner, and basically the bone marrow goes out into your bloodstream and goes to your brain and gives you an embolism, and it eventually kills you. So at that time, Catherine wasn't able to obtain any sort of recourse or accountability for these medical errors that occurred. 19 years later, Lindsay Keene in Nanaimo was crossing the street, was hit by a truck. She survived the impact. She had a long bone fracture, her femur. And the surgeon that evening at Nanaimo Hospital said, I'll get to this surgery, tomorrow. We'll get around to it then. So same thing as Heidi Klumpus 19 years earlier, fat embolism syndrome. She went to her brain. She died a matter of weeks later. It's the exact same preventable medical error nearly 2 decades apart. Had there been some financial accountability, the insurers may have said, hey, we need to call all surgeons in. We need to do a retraining about fat embolism syndrome right now. We can't have one of these other, $500,000 lawsuits ever again. Let's fix it now. But instead, these same incidents keep happening over and over again. And the same is true when, most doctors are very, very good. There's a few bad apples who keep repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again, and they need to be weeded out as well. So that's basic. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, they're more likely to be reform, accountability. It's not simply about financial benefits for the remaining family. That it doesn't seem to be the main focus of your argument for reform.
It's financial penalty to wrongdoers. And and essentially the last kind of aspect I want to point out is that they call it non-pecuniary damages, which means non-economic, which are not available in cases of wrongful death in BC. I'd make the argument that these are immeasurably economic because people, have to take time off work, they lose careers, marriages, falter, in some cases crumble, and people who are self-employed, their businesses just go down the toilet. Like there's just no way to quantify that. So the way that legislators in other provinces have tried to do that is through the loss of companionship class that at least allows to value the life in so much that a financial accountability can be sought against wrongdoers through a court litigation process that would also expose the truth, to which, for example, Ann Forry simply still doesn't have any answers or hardly any answers here.
Thank you, Michael. We are going to just take a pause from talking with you. We're going to play your song request. I'm going to ask you about that. And then we're going to talk to Mike Jong, the official critic for Attorney General. And then you're going to come back on the line, if you don't mind, to wrap this topic up with us. And so you requested a Revolution song and also the Manic Street Preachers. Tell us why you requested that one.
Well, the Manic Street Preachers song, the song I requested is, if you tolerate this, then your children will be next. And I requested that because every British Columbia needs to make it their personal responsibility to get this legislation modernized, because it could be your parents, it could be your children, it could be anyone who touches your life could be affected if this is not done at this critical time. And that's why I requested that song. The second song being the Beatles' Revolution, because we see ourselves, our society, our volunteer group as a revolutionary movement, and we're trying to shake up the establishment and get this thing done.
And we're back. That song goes out to the In Their Name Society and especially to Ann Forry. We have Mike DeYoung on the phone. Good morning, Mike.
Kimberly, great to be on the program with you.
Oh, thank you for joining us. Can you introduce Tofino, Ucluelet, and anyone who's listening online to who you are?
I'm Mike DeYoung, calling from Abbotsford, where I have been the MLA these past 27 years, and in former public service was finance minister and attorney general for a period of time. And I'm presently the official opposition critic for the Ministry of the Attorney General.
What does that mean you actually do as the official opposition critic?
Well, it's in our parliamentary system a task that I'm assigned to keep watch, to critique, to examine policies, particularly in the area of the Attorney General's ministry. One of those issues is something that you have taken, I'm happy to say, great interest in and are discussing today. But it is to keep a watch, not just on spending decisions, but on some of the policies that the government is advancing, and to debate them, discuss them, criticize them if warranted, and suggest some alternatives.
So are you currently debating the Wrongful Death Act in British Columbia?
No.
Why not?
When you say debating, first of all, the parliamentary session isn't in session, but I think perhaps if you mean, has it received any attention from the government thus far? Have they presented any indication of a willingness to consider changes to bring our legislation, which is woefully out of date, up to date? No, we haven't seen any indication of that from the government or the Attorney General to this point, at least.
So how would you interpret a statement from the Attorney General that says it's a priority, but then you yourself are in government and you're not seeing it? that doesn't seem to be coherent.
Difficult to reconcile those two statements. I'm not sure what the Attorney General's definition of priority is. Look, I'm not just about criticizing. If the Attorney General says it's a priority, then let's take him at his word. And when Parliament does, when the legislature does resume sitting in about 3 weeks, I imagine we'll see some legislation updating.
And can you do that as the critic?
Well, one of the options is to introduce private members' legislation, but the government rarely, if ever, considers passing that or will pass that. It is really for a change of this magnitude. It requires all of the resources of the Attorney General's ministry and the government to advance the kind of amendments that are necessary to bring our legislation up to date and in line with other provinces. And look, if the government's prepared to do that, then I'm anxious to see that work. We've seen no indication that is the case so far, at least.
Now, when you say it takes all of the resources, what is the process in BC for reforming a law or modernizing an act?
Well, first, political will. It starts there. It requires a direction from the government, the Premier and the Attorney General and the Cabinet to say we are going to update this legislation. So that's the first thing. There's then a lot of technical work in terms of drafting legislation. The bills are complex legal instruments.
Have you seen the Wrongful Death Society's drafting of the new law, just to look at it?
I have. Okay. I don't have it in front of me, but yes, there's been work done. And in fact, just over a decade ago when I was Attorney General, we came very close and had some extensive work and drafting work done. But the forces opposed to this within government and outside of government are formidable. And you and I have talked about that in the past, the agencies that do not want to see our legislation updated, and that's unfortunate.
How could that be, that the forces are formidable or speak louder than the voices of British Columbians?
It is, I don't have an answer for that, and I think it's wrong. I think that when you examine the situation, and this is going to sound terrible to your listeners. I mean, is there anything worse than a family and a mother and father who lose a child in an accident? I can't imagine anything worse than that. And to try and quantify that monetarily is impossible and seems cold and unfeeling. And yet what I cannot understand is how, since that is the mechanism courts have available to them, why a child in British Columbia is worth significantly less, and the grief associated with the loss of that child worth significantly less than a child in Alberta or Ontario or other provinces in BC. And that's the situation right now.
You mentioned earlier about a private member's bill, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you said it's not taken seriously in terms of putting that on the table as an act of legislation. Why not?
Virtually never, and it is an indication of the seriousness with which the government takes opposition initiatives. If it's not on their agenda, they're not going to surrender time in the Legislative Assembly to debate and pass a piece of opposition legislation. It is the government controls virtually absolutely what is discussed in the Legislative Assembly. The bills that are presented for for debate, and that is particularly so in a situation like we now have with a majority government.
And so were you around? I mean, your resume is impressive and very diverse. Were you around in 2011 when MLA Ralph Sultan brought forth his private members bill to reform the act?
And in fact, worked with Ralph.
And what happened? What happened? How can we make sure that won't happen again?
Well, it will require a lot of pressure of the sort that we are beginning to see. Look, agencies like ICBC, insurers, continue to push back in the other direction and continue to describe a scenario that I think is exaggerated. There is a way, in my view, to craft legislation to provide recognition of the incredible loss that is suffered by a family that doesn't open the floodgates, that isn't going to bankrupt the province, and yet that is the scenario that opponents of this frequently present. I know that because I was there when they did it.
So are you trying to say that it's a cost benefit now? Like ICBC is presenting a very expensive scenario to British Columbians if we change the act?
Exactly.
Okay, so who else has presented different economics?
In terms of
the cost to British Columbians? Are we only looking at ICBC's research? Are we looking at anyone else, third parties? Have there been grants to apply for other economists to look at this long-term to British Columbians?
Well, we actually don't have to look far. We can look to what other provinces have done.
Okay.
And so, which is why I have never really understood why these apocalyptic scenarios seem to carry the day. We have other models that we can look at that would be a tremendous improvement over what we have in British Columbia, and it's something that we should be moving towards.
So, in your opinion, what does tremendous pressure look like?
In what sense, Kimberly?
You mentioned the private members bill isn't effective for reforming law. It will be tremendous pressure that will bring this legislation to the table. What does that look like?
Well, I think the most. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I misunderstood.
No, that's okay.
I think the most compelling arguments are that which we are seeing today from family members who have really humanized what this loss represents and what our outdated legislation has meant for those families. So putting a human face on tragedy is asking a lot of people, but that's what we are seeing because people really do believe in this, and I am hopeful that the work that people are doing now to draw attention to this will ultimately be successful, and I am certainly supportive.
So we're not going to have the same conversation in 4 years, right?
Well, I hope not.
Do you feel confident that it will pass in this election term of the NDP?
Well, I guess the person that can answer that question the most confidently is the Premier and the Attorney General, but I and we in the opposition will certainly do what we can to continue to draw attention and encourage them and be supportive.
I really appreciate that. Forward. I think British Columbians appreciate that. I can't imagine there are too many people that are against this reform or this modernization. So thank you for taking the time to speak with me this morning. We're actually going to finish this interview with Michael once again. But before I let you go, I put you on the spot, but do you have a song request? I'd
like you to play any song with the word hope in it.
Oh, I love that. Leaving it open. We'll play a hope song for you. We asked a guest for a song reply request once, and he asked for a pan flute, like a 12-minute pan flute song. And we just thought, okay, next time we have to ask in advance. So I'm very happy you didn't ask for that. So here we go, a hope song for you, Mike DeYoung. Thank you for doing what you do. And we'll hopefully be in touch with you as more good news unveils itself from this reform.
Thanks so much for this.
Okay, we are back with Mike from In Their Name Society. Hello, Michael. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, Kimberly.
You heard me speak with Mike DeYoung?
Yeah, I did. It was a really positive and constructive call.
It felt that way, but we've been talking about that a little bit, about the statements that you get from these ministries, and then, you know, what that really looks like on the ground. But he seemed to actually illustrate what that would be like on the ground for him when they meet again in 3 weeks.
Yeah, he certainly did. One thing that was really poignant is that Mike talked about ICBC exaggerating their scenarios, because, you know, we did some number estimation, and then ICBC's obviously done some estimation that no one's ever been able to see outside of cabinet. So I think Mike's kind of shone a bit of a light on that for the public to take a look at. And one thing I want to point out quickly is that if we go back to the 1990s, this isn't the first time that ICBC tried to introduce this no-fault model. Back then, they met a lot of resistance from a coalition of over 207 nonprofits that actually defeated no fault back then in the court of public opinion. So the exaggerated numbers they used back then is they said, oh, ICBC is going to be in a $2.4 billion deficit. We need this no fault. It got defeated, and then they all scratched their heads, and they're like, oh, maybe we should do this root cause prevention that everyone keeps talking about. They brought in the graduated licensing program, and there was a 5-year rate freeze and approximately $600 million in profit by focusing on root cause prevention. That's what an insurer is supposed to do. Not diminish the rights and damages available for victims, but actually focus on preventing accidents, injury, and wrongful death in the first place. And that was illustrative back in the 90s there.
I see. So are you worried about no fault coming in May?
I'm extremely worried. I think it's a Band-Aid solution. The RAND Institute in the United States has actually done studies that regimes down there that have switched from the tort system to no fault, they saved a little money at first, but then the cost eventually rose again, and it either met or exceeded that of the pre-tort levels. So I don't think I think this is a temporary solution. I think it's going to get much worse. I think our roads are going to become safer because of it, and I think it's still going to be an impediment to modernizing our wrongful death laws, unless the NDP or the BC provincial government can change our minds and actually agree that we need to champion and bring forth a first-class piece of legislation. That's what we're hoping gets passed. What will be really underwhelming and pathetic is that they just went to another province that, modernized their legislation a couple decades ago and just brought out their photocopiers and then passed that. It would be still insufficient. We have a real opportunity to bring forth this first-class piece of legislation that would set an example for the rest of Canada, rather than playing this pathetic game of catch-up.
And about no fault or enhanced care, I wonder if they're hoping to quiet or to placate victims a little bit. It seems under the enhanced care or no fault model that victims are entitled to more than they are currently, and that there is a death benefit, so that there is some kind of recourse, but it's not litigious.
So just to clarify that, there is no pain and suffering class of damages anymore when someone who is not at fault was injured because of some other driver's negligence. So that is completely taken out of the equation. They just claim, oh, we'll take care of you, don't worry about it, we'll pay for your chiropractor visits, that type of thing. So that there is a huge amount of damages or benefits that have been taken out of it. When you look at the death benefit side, as they call it, benefits now under this model, they're no longer called damages. It's only slightly better for people who were at fault and were killed because it was their fault. So those benefits or damages have increased for people who are at fault. But for people who are not at fault, there's just simply very little increase in any sort of damages or benefits that are available. If we look over in Ontario, they still allow you to bring forth at-fault wrongful death claims in their motor vehicle accidents. So they have that on top of their, they have somewhat of a partial no-fault system there, but you can still bring those wrongful death claims over and above their no-fault benefit system, but that's simply still not going to be allowed in British Columbia.
Okay, that was going to be my next question. And in the same vein, can a family, privately sue the hospital and not go through the insurance? Can they sue the hospital if there is perceived malpractice, or not at all?
Let's look at the situation with Natasha here. So Anne could sue the hospital, but according to our current Family Compensation Act, the only thing that she can claim is pecuniary or economic damages, which would be basically the cost of the funeral. And that's what she's limited to. So if this were in another jurisdiction, let's just say, Ontario, for example, or maybe Alberta, there would be a cumulative amount of these loss of companionship, care, guidance, love, affection damages that set that foundation of human life in these other jurisdictions, and that Natasha's surviving family members could have pooled together and then brought a wrongful death action against perhaps the hospital or the doctors or whoever was found or deemed to be negligent. And then there could have been some actual truth and some answers, and nothing brings the truth out like court and being able to depose everyone who was involved. Currently, that process only happens behind closed doors, and under Section 51 of the Evidence Act, it's excluded from the families ever being able to see those answers. So we're just, not only denied justice, but we're denied access to the truth as well.
Yeah, that was shocking to hear that this morning. Have you, in your experience, seen cases in other jurisdictions where the modernization of the Wrongful Death Act has led to deference? Like, you've seen the act passed and then you've seen companies improve safety standards as a result of it. Like, can you draw that positive correlation happening?
Yeah, certainly. So maybe not necessarily exactly in the instance of wrongful death. There's many cases out there, I'm sure, but just one that comes to mind is that in other jurisdictions, for example, there was a family that had their house burned down, and the insurer basically baselessly claimed that the family had burned it down themselves, and they were denying coverage, and this family was left homeless and destitute. So they were able to go and get a lawyer, and they were able to sue the insurer, and they were able to get a civil jury trial. And as a result of that, the jury felt that it was just so egregious that this insurer completely baselessly denied their claim coverage, that they awarded what was called punitive damages. And punitive damages are a class of damages that are a financial penalty in cases of egregious wrongdoing. And then that really set a precedent across the insurance industry that, hey, you can't deny coverage baselessly. So the same applies in wrongful death. If someone is just extremely negligent in their conduct and it leads to someone dying wrongfully, and this goes in front of especially a jury trial, the jury is able to set these punitive damages, and there's a rippling effect throughout that industry, and it sets a precedent like, hey, we cannot do this again. We need to have a safe system or vehicle or whatever that might be to ensure that we don't do this in the future. Otherwise, without that financial deterrence, and when there's no financial penalty, the change and the deterrence just doesn't happen.
Thank you. My last question for you is just about what British Columbians right now can do. I went on your website last night. I love your website. You have a very easy petition your MLA or write a letter to your MLA, and you just click who your MLA is and the letter automatically goes to their office. It's so easy. But what else can British Columbians do if they have been hearing this interview about putting forth reform or modernization to this antiquated law?
Yeah, certainly. So I think when you come to our website and you learn more about this issue, and you can also petition your MLA. It's based on your postal code where that submission gets submitted to. It kind of puts your name in the hat, so to speak. But what really I think makes the best impression is when you actually call up your MLA or ask to have a meeting with them and have eyeballs looking at them face to face, explaining how much this issue means to you. So we have on our website an MLA meeting kit that gives full step-by-step instructions how you can do this. It's intheirname.ca/MLA-meeting-kit, and it walks you through how you can get educated on the issue, how you can reach out to your MLA and speak to them, because the MLAs need to know about it. They then need to go and speak to the Attorney General. They need to feel that cumulative pressure from everywhere across the province that this is something that really matters to, as Mike Jong said, to develop that political will to get this cross the goal line. And then you can develop a relationship with your MLA that you can hold them accountable to on this issue, rather than sitting back and expecting them to just do it, or expecting our society as unpaid volunteers just to be these heroes that go and get it done for everyone. Like, everyone needs to make it their personal responsibility to get this done.
Yeah, and you have done a tremendous amount of work as a volunteer, and I would urge people listening that have been moved by this interview, moved by yourself, to donate. It's very easy to donate, just like it's easy to petition your MLA. Thank you so much, Michael, James, Pennie. This was an educational week, getting to know you and learning about this Wrongful Death Act. I hear you may have an appointment with David Eby before the legislature meets. Is that true, or are you just trying to get one?
I mean, I sent him the legislation last year, and I requested a meeting, and that was denied, as well as we were asking for their position prior to the election, and they ignored us. I've submitted the most recent version of the updated legislation to Minister Eby's office, and have requested a meeting before the legislative session in the spring, because I would like to hear what he has to say about this, kind of off the mainstream media cameras. And I'm still waiting to hear back if any such meeting will take place. So I remain hopeful.
Great. Please tell us the good news when you get that call back, and we'll talk to you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for your great coverage of this issue. It just means so much to us and all British Columbians and the families that we represent.
I want to thank Anne as well. As I said, it's 3 months since losing her daughter. It's amazing that she can stand on her 2 feet, never mind give interviews, and also, seek justice. It's it's awe-inspiring for me to hear her. So thank you, Anne, for coming on and sharing your story this morning. And thank you to Mike Jong. I feel very confident that this law is going to be modernized.